Okay, first we'll start with an overview of what the clinic covers. How do you define the classic era? I arbitrarily said 1930 to 1960. Can you hold it down, please? We're not going to stop. You can pick your definitions of eras, but for the purpose of this clinic, it's 1930 to 1960. Just a fact, in general, boxcars were more freely interchanged than other car types. Every part of North America had use for boxcars. Other car types tended to be more regionally focused, more concentrated in one area than another, but boxcars were closer to being universal. And that means that even a car that was part of a short line would show up somewhere else. And it had a probability of showing up anywhere because of the fact that it was a nationwide pool that cars could show up anywhere. And during the classic era, the New York Central had more boxcars than anybody else. So therefore, if you model railroads and you're interested in freight cars, then you have to be interested in the New York Central boxcars. And here's a table that shows, not a table, chart that shows the top line, which you can see in the original slide that's green. That's timeline on the bottom. That shows you how before the Depression, the New York Central by far had more cars. And I'm not really sure why they had more before the Depression. I mean, you could say they had more 36-foot cars and they replaced them by 40-foot cars, but so did everybody else. So I'm not sure of the explanation. Excuse me, but it's hard for me to speak while you're talking about it back there. Thank you. The next line, I believe, is the Pennsy, although I can't remember. It might be Canadian National, because CN had a very large fleet, and CP had a very large fleet. The one that's interesting is the dark one near the bottom. That's Southern Pacific. And they, in the post-war era, there was a lot of new industrial expansion in the West, and they were benefiting from that. So their fleet was increasing when you see all these other roads were decreasing, which was not only shift from rail to truck, but it was also shifting to larger cars with more capacity. You need fewer cars to provide the same service. Okay, major groups of boxcars in New York Central. It's because Central didn't have a classification system like Pennsy did. You have to try to apply some kind of logic to define different groups of cars. We had 36-foot cars, and they were built mostly in that era before World War I. 40-foot cars that were a New York Central design, and this would be the kits that Westerfield has done on HO. And Storzek did the wood sheet cars. I forget, because I'm not an HO modeler anymore, but has somebody come out with wood sheet cars again? Somebody other than Storzek cars? Okay, well, Westerfield's got both. That's what I thought. Okay. But anyway, the New York Central design was both wood and steel sheet, and that included the Rutland 8000s and 9000s. Those are of that group. And then the USRA designs, during the USRA period, the New York Central got actual USRA cars, both single sheet and double sheet. But there was also the all-steel design that USRA never ordered, but the New York Central went big time for that design, as we'll see. And then by the late 30s, the AAR designs came in, and the Central went with those. So those are the major groups. And here's a timeline chart that shows how those populations went over time. And you can see all those 36-foot cars and how they dropped precipitously during the Depression. And that's why the overall total went down. And those 1916 design cars stayed pretty constant until up into the mid-50s. And the USRA steel designs were the backbone from when they were built in the 20s. You can see that wedge opening up during the 20s. And then they were really the bulk of the fleet right up into the early 60s. And then the AAR cars and then 50-foot cars came in. And again, smaller numbers of the cars in later years for those two reasons I already mentioned. Okay, 36-foot cars. The truss rod cars were dying out rapidly by the time the classic era starts in 1930. There were a few around. They were totally gone before 1950. The 1910 design, which you'll see pictures of, they built them in large numbers. There were variations in underframes within that group, and I'll show you all those. The 1912 design, they built in even larger numbers, and that was an RPI kit made by Panero and Camerlengo. I don't know if they still make that. Yeah. And then these were upgraded in various ways during the 30s, which you'll see. Here's a car as built. Lakeshore and Michigan Southern was the predecessor before 1914. This car is built in 1910. And this has a fish belly center sill and no visible side sill structure. Now here's a car of very similar design, but in the classic era, it's had a lot of modernization. I should go back to the other one for a moment. This is before the Safety Appliance Act of 1911. So it does not have the standard ladders on the corner, doesn't have any grabs at the left end. It's only got a sill step at the right, it doesn't have one on the left, and various other differences. And there's some other features that I'll point out here where it's modernized. Now you've got all the Safety Appliance Act. This car also has been upgraded with a corrugated steel end. It's been upgraded to a cast steel side frame truck. And this is one thing very characteristic of New York Central. With all their wood sheet cars by the late 20s, they all had, I gotta get my pointer instead of waving my arm. This piece of wood is a doorstop, and it's maybe a 3x3 or maybe even 4x4 timber piece of wood that's fastened on the side of the car, and that was the doorstop. And if you look again at that previous car, it's just got a couple of little castings here, and somebody in the New York Central Mechanical Department decided little castings aren't enough, we're going to put in this big timber. And it became universal sometime after the mid-20s. Anything that got any shopping got this wood timber, and you'll see that in pictures. There's also a lot of extra bracing that wasn't on the car as built. And also, I'm not sure about this car, but a lot of cars were upgraded to AV brakes.
Jeff, did that style doorstop last till the end of the cars? Right?
Yeah. Okay, 1910 design. What I'm talking about here, between 6,000 and 10,000, I don't know the numbers because I'm not sure, but between 6,000 and 10,000 were built with this very heavy C-channel sights, which you can see. This is one of those cars, this big heavy side sill. This is a shot taken in the late 30s, I believe. It tells right there, but you can't read it. So I can read it on the screen. 1937. Now, 37 is just when this Herald came into use. So this is a very recent repaint, obviously. But I'm not sure how many of these cars were built, but it was a large number, suffice to say. And it's a very easy spotting feature because I don't know of anyone else that had the heavy side sill. Okay, the 1912 design, 17,000 with wood sheathed ends before 1914, and then over 6,000 war cars built new with the steel ends starting in 1914, and those were 1914, but another couple of lots were built in 1917. And the spotting feature is this side sill is partially visible, which you can see here. There's a steel angle, and this is just like the later 40-foot cars had the same structure of the bolster and the side sill and the fish belly center sill and the 7/7 inverted Murphy corrugated ends. All the same as the 40-foot cars, except these are 4 feet short. And this is a car that has been upgraded over the years. You can't see the brake system, it's all on the other side, so, but it does have the cast steel trucks. Okay, now we go to the 40-foot cars. Over 10,000 cars with wood sheathing, 6,500 with steel sheathing, and the ends, roof, and underframe were common, except for the side sill treatment. Here's a steel sheath car. These were all built in 1916, if I'm not mistaken. This car has been upgraded later with more modern doors. It's also got the lettering style that would be post-1930. This is one of a unique lot that had end doors. There's only one lot that had end doors. And again, these are not the original trucks. The trucks have been upgraded. And here's the wood sheath car, and this is a shot that was taken in the 30s, just before this car went into the shop to be rebuilt with steel sheathing. But here you've got the wood door stops. You can't see the AB brakes, but it's got cast steel trucks upgraded. Okay, now the USRA era. 2,500 single sheath cars and 2,250 double sheath cars. They were all built in 1919. The USRA never ordered the all steel design, and the transition back to private control. Note the date, February 1920. I believe that's significant. So here's a single sheath car. Again, in later years, still has the original Andrews trucks. Still has the K brakes, although the lettering's been upgraded. And this is a double sheath car, and this is a renumbering post 1936, I believe. And these cars didn't last long. A lot of these were sold to TH&B in 1940. And I think only one car was rebuilt with steel sheathing. All the other USRA double sheath cars were either scrapped, sold off, or retired still with wood sheath. They never did a rebuild program for lots of cars. Okay, now coming out of USRA control, I'm calling these a transition design car, and you'll see what these look like. Apparently based on further development of the 1916 design. In late 1920, there were 2,250 cars built in 3 lots, and take note of the lot numbers, 4, 17, 18, and 19. And these all had 4-foot auxiliary doors. And here's what these cars looked like. They were very similar to the 1916 designed steel sheath cars, except here you see there's a gusset structure under the side sill for the door track, but it ends where the door track ends. And there's kind of a little tab here, probably for a cross tie, and then the bolster here. The 1916 design had a single plate that went from bolster to bolster. You know, without having seen drawings, I can't tell the details of what all was different, but they clearly were tinkering with the underframe design, but still a fish belly center sill, and still basically a design that is relying on the center sill for structural strength and not relying on the side structure to be load-bearing structure. It's just a side sheathing. It's not intended to carry any load. And also, this is a Hutchins roof, not the Hutchins that you may be familiar with in the late 20s and 30s. It's a different design. And here's one of the same cars in later years. This has been upgraded with a Murphy solid steel roof. It's got AB brakes. The trucks have been upgraded. Still has its original doors though, which is interesting. And the lettering scheme has been upgraded to go with the times. Okay, now at the same time, nearly simultaneously, 1,750 cars were built. The lot numbers for 14, 15, and 16 are consecutive with the other 3 lots for transition design cars. And only the 416 lot had the 4-foot auxiliary doors. And there were some deviations from the USRA design. They used the Murphy solid steel roof instead of the generic roof that the USRA design had. They used an 8.7 Murphy corrugated end instead of 5.5 that the USRA specified. And here's a picture of one of these cars. And again, this is post classic era cutoff. So, but this car is pretty original, except it does have AB brakes. But it's got the original Andrews trucks. It's got the 8.7 corrugated Murphy ends, steel sheathing with 4 panels to either side of the door. And this car was built as a single door car. And probably was built with a flat panel door. That was probably an upgraded door. Subsequent production of the USRA design all steel cars. Another 16,950 single door cars, 4,000 with auxiliary doors, built over a 6-year period. Then they went to another height, 9'4", 2,000 and 3,000 single door and with auxiliary doors built in a 5-year period. And then finally 10-foot high, built in the late 20s, 1,000 with auxiliary doors of only 4 foot wide, and then 4,000 more with 6 foot wide. And none of these are the USRA height, which is 9 feet. The first 3 lots were 9 feet, so you got 4 different heights. And Westerfield makes the 8'7" high car. So there, as far as I know, there's no models in any scale except for a few low-scale brass cars that they did of the 9'4", and I think they might have done the 10'0" as well. But there isn't much coverage of these cars that were built in very large numbers. Okay, here's 8'7" high, and I'll show you some spotting features. This is an original door. This has cast steel trucks, which would have been added later. Big Four, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Chicago, and St. Louis. Pretty well-known subsidiary. Everyone knows about it. They stopped lettering cars Big Four in 1936. So anything that was repainted after 36 is going to be renumbered into a New York Central number block. There is a handout, but I didn't bring any copies of. If you really want it, give me your address and I'll send you a copy of it. It runs like 14 or 16 pages. And it's got lots of roster data. So if you want to know specific car numbers, it'll tell you like what this car was renumbered to if it survived long enough to get renumbered. Anyway, by 1950, Big Four and Michigan Central were extremely rare, and by 1950, 2 or 3 totally gone. So depending on what area you're modeling, if you have any Big Four or Michigan Central cars, you should only have a tiny number and don't run them on your layout every operating session. Okay, here's the 8'7" inside height with a dreadnought end. These were built, I think, in 26 with a 4'4" dreadnought end instead of the Murphy corrugated end. And again, the handout will give you specifics on which lots. Okay, in 1924, these cars were built for the Rutland. These were with the auxiliary door in the 9000 series, and the difference from the New York Central, of course, is the ends are 8 and 6 rather than 7 and 7. All the cars produced in 1916 and 18 were 7 and 7 ends, and also this gusset was on a 45-degree angle, whereas this one's extended. So that was the difference between the 1916 design and the Rutland cars built in 1924. There were also some Cincinnati Northern cars followed the same design, built in 1922, and another lot built in 1924. And they were the same as the Rutland cars, had the 8-6 ends rather than 7-7. And that must have had something to do with the company that made the ends, for some reason, didn't want to make 7-7, so they went with the 8-6. But they still went with the inward corrugations, whereas for the all-steel cars, they were doing outward corrugations. And I don't know why choices like that were made. The other thing is the Rutland 8000 series cars, which were single door, were the only cars ever built with this design out of nearly 20,000 cars. The only ones that were built with a single door. All the others were built with auxiliary door. Now, in the late 20s and into the 30s, a lot of them had the auxiliary door eliminated and became single door cars. So, they had them, but they weren't built that way. Only the Rutland cars were built that way. Okay, here's the medium height, and they've added an extra rib. There's 9 ribs down here instead of 8, so now it's 9 and 7. And there's more flat area above the top rib. So the 8'7" high car, which has 8 and 7 ribs, the top rib here is very close to the eave of the roof. So that's an easy spotting feature. If you don't know your car numbers, if you can see the end of the car, it's really easy to distinguish an 8', 7" car because it's very little space there. A 9'0" car, one of those original 3 lots, would have some space there, but still be 8'7". And a 9'4" car would be 9 on the lower panel. And this car was probably built with the Youngstown doors. By the mid-20s, they had gone to the corrugated Youngstown doors. And here's a 10'0" high car. This car has 3 dreadnought panels with 3 corrugations each. Those were the cars built in 1926. And then the cars built in 29-30 would have 2 panels with 5 and 4. I can't remember if I have a picture of those or not. So here's a summary of all the cars that were built. I'm not going to go through all that now, but the grand total of all heights, 32,700 cars, which is more than the Pennsylvania had X-29s and X-28s. So this was the most numerous boxcar design of a single railroad. Now, in 1925, MDT shops built 100 of these cars, Lot 504B. And if you may already know this, but I'll have to go through it quickly. During the 1920s, the American Railway Association, which was an outgrowth of the National Car Builders Association, there was a lot of political maneuvering between different railroad companies. There was factions who wanted to standardize freight car designs because it saved money, saved on inventory for repair shops. There's a lot of good reasons to go to standardization. And there was a faction that didn't want standardization because it would stifle creativity and, you know, it would force different master mechanics to go with a design they didn't approve of for whatever reason, be it legitimate or not. So there was all this political infighting within the ARA, and they finally, in 1923, adopted some standardized recommended designs, but never adopted as a standard because they couldn't get the votes in the committees to adopt it as a standard. So there was this 1923 recommended standard all steel design boxcar, which the ARA recommended design was basically the Pennsy X-29. And so in 1925, the New York Central apparently decided, well, let's sample it. So they had 100 cars built in MDT, which is the company-owned shops. They built 100 cars. You can get a model of this from Red Caboose in HO scale. I'm not sure if it's available in any other scales, but they had 100 of these cars out of 50,000 cars. So yeah, if you've got one of these, it's accurate, but run on your layout once every 5 years because people didn't see these cars. But this is a builder's photo. Well, that's interesting. Something's missing here.
There's 2 airports.
Well, just let me finish the story. I don't know why there's a slide missing. But at the same time as Lot 504B, they also built Lot 503B, which I believe was 500 cars. Why it was a larger number, I'm not sure. But those were standard 8'7" USRA all-steel design, built by MDT shops. And I think the 2 lots were built side by side, and I think they were carefully monitoring how much does material cost, how many hours we put into this sub-assembly, how many hours we put into that sub-assembly. But I think they were carefully comparing which car was more economical to build, and they probably ran them for a while to see how they were for operating. And clearly, they didn't do any more of these, so their decision was stick with their own design. Now, we'll talk about evolution of paint and lettering. As built from 1920 to 1930, these cars, they had periods in the reporting marks up to mid to late 1928, except Michigan Central, Peoria Eastern, Cincinnati Northern didn't have just the letters, they had the names spelled out. And Michigan Central had the letters underlined except for the initial letters, but these 2 did not have underlined. So that's got to be, you know, local management prerogative that they still had enough independence to do things a little differently. But that died out. Now, the S prefix, which you've seen on some of these photos, did not exist before fall of 1922. The Lot 437B cars were the first cars built new with the S prefix. And the S prefix was a ploy to try to improve car utilization by saying that the car was a system car. The S stood for a system, meaning supposing you had a Boston Albany car that had been sent to the West Coast with a load, and it came back empty and was delivered at St. Louis to the Big Four. Instead of moving it empty from St. Louis all the way back to Albany to return to the home road, which is Boston Albany, by saying it's a system car, it's considered return to home road to St. Louis because it's the New York Central system. So that saved empty car miles. They could reload it to St. Louis, and then the car got better utilization that way. That's what the S prefix stood for. It also was used as a condemnation limit for billing. When cars were damaged offline, the railroad that had an offline car that was damaged for whatever reason, there would be, in the tariff, there would be a billing limit. If the damage cost more than a certain amount, then they'd scrap the car. Well, the S prefix cars had a higher billing limit than the non-S prefix cars. So the S prefix served two functions. They were the newest cars and the highest value cars, so that was what that was all about. Stencil lines above and below the reporting marks. They only show up mid-1924 on Lot 492B on as-built cars. They show up later because the ARA recommended that as a standard practice, but New York Central didn't adopt it until the 30s. New York Central lines in Roman lettering and a black background, 48 3/8 inch wide oval. That was absolutely standard, did not vary from 1906 until 1936. And the AAR dimensional data, which again, that was actually it's ARA in the 20s. That was recommended practice for cars in interchange. The data that you showed central inside the car, what it was and where it was located, was all specified. And that changed in the late 20s. And for cars built new, the first lot was 585B in January 29. Okay, now we go to the ARA standard boxcar 1932. This is a unique car. New York Central number 100,000 was built for the American Railway Association. They built at least 3 prototype cars, ARA 1, ARA 2, ARA 3. The New York Central 100,000 is the ARA 1. And it was the only car of this design the New York Central had. So again, you can buy a resin kit from Sunshine Models to model this car. They had one car. So for every 100 times you have your red caboose model, you have this out once.
Run them both at once. But never again.
And these cars, they're only 9 foot 4 inch inside height, whereas the 1937 design was 10 foot inside height. They're also, I think, 6 inches narrower in width. And there's some differences in the details of the underframe. And also the ends are 4/4, and by the time you get to 1937 design, it's 4/5. So now the renumber in 1936, very complex. That's when they changed from New York Central lines to New York Central system, and so that changed in Herald, and they decided to put forth a general plan for renumbering, and it took more than a decade to actually re-stencil cars. Like I was saying, Big Four cars into the early 50s were still kicking around, and 1936, Big Four was in the plan immediately. Michigan Central didn't come into the plan until about 1940. I don't know the exact year. And most of the older cars were assigned numbers above 200,000. So that's just a general rule of thumb. Like if you see a photo of a locomotive and there's a New York Central car poking out the back. If the number is 200,000 or higher, it's a 36-foot car. And many of the clone USRA steel cars were placed in an almost solid block, 101,000, 125, 499. But there were lots of exceptions to that. And if you get the handout, it'll explain all that. Okay, here's how reporting marks changed as reported in the equipment registers. So, you know, there's a little bit of question of how accurate that is, but you can see how all these subsidiaries plummeted through the late 30s and through the World War II period, and they were down to very small numbers. P&LE, of course, remained and was pretty solid right through the 60s. And the bulk of the cars in the post-World War II era would be lettered New York Central, not for subsidiaries. And more evolution of paint and lettering in the 1930s. The S prefix was discontinued about 1933. I can't tell exactly when. They introduced the stripes above and below the reporting marks. I'm not sure of the date of that. Changed from New York Central lines to New York Central system. And in the 1940s, the black background was taken out of the oval, we think, just to remove black paint from inventory in car shops. But it was about 1944. So you'll see a car with all oxide red side and have the oval and it's oxide red inside the oval. Whereas before 1944 it was all black. Now here's a car, you can tell even as badly weathered as that Herald is, it's clearly got a black background. But this car was renumbered after 1936. You can see the number is 256,000, I forget the exact number. And it's got all the same features we talked about before. Here's a 1916 steel car, post renumbering. This again is over 200,000, but that's a small block of cars. Okay, a lot of 1916 design cars got rebuilt in the 1930s. It really got going around 35, 36 at MDT shops in East Rochester. And they turned out thousands of these cars. Most of the existing fleet went through the rebuilding. And there were lots of variations. I'll just go over the highlights of that. This car is all new sheathing. You can see there's 5 panels. The cars that were steel sheathed originally, they had 5 panels as well, but they had alternating laps, whereas this is a constant lap in the same direction. And this car's had height increase. You can see the extra panel with 2 ribs, but the new side panels are full height. If they kept the old side panels, they would have to add extensions. And there are examples of those. This has a Murphy rectangular raised panel roof, which is an improvement. This car originally had an auxiliary door that's been eliminated, so now you got a single door. That's a new Youngstown door, and it's new Castile AAR design trucks and AV brakes. So that was a major rebuilding, but it's still got the steel fish belly center sill, which is about the only thing remaining from the original car. Okay, the USRA single sheath and double sheath cars. This is a single sheath rebuild. There's HO kits for this. These cars were, when originally rebuilt, were Pittsburgh and Peaceport and Yakagani, also known as P. Mickey. They were relettered to P&LE without changing the numbers pretty quickly. The cars were rebuilt in the late 30s, and by 1940 they were relettering them into P&LE. So if you're not modeling pre-World War II, your car should be P&LE, not P. Mickey. But the spotting feature is the inset side sill with these cast brackets. That's because the USRA single sheet cars were narrower. So when they put on the double sheet sides, they extended them out. And there's also a tricky construction of the corners here to accommodate that extra width, because they reused the original end panels, which were not that wide. Okay, here's a USRA steel car that these are the original panels as built, but they've increased the height, so they've added panels. And they've also added another panel on the end with 2 more ribs of the corrugation. And this was done in 1932 or 3, if I recall. These doors I'm not sure what's going on here because they weren't making new Preco doors in 1933. So somehow they took the original doors and made them a higher height. But this panel is not the same height as this extension, so I haven't made sense out of it. But somehow they did that. Another way of increasing height was by keeping the original sides, but just extending the eave. There's a 6-inch extension here, and they've even done that on the end, because this is one of those lots that had indoors. They didn't extend the height of the doors, they just put this extension above the doors. I'm not sure what else to point out there.
Yeah, just for a little time check, we gotta
Okay,
get ready for a party tomorrow, so.
5 minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm getting near the end. This has had the auxiliary door eliminated, AV brakes upgraded, still has the original Andrews trucks. Not sure what else has changed there. You finally go to AAR cars. They never did the 1932 design, and they didn't get their first 40-foot cars till 1940. In 1939, they got some 50-foot cars that resembled AAR design, but AAR didn't adopt the standard design for 50-foot until 1942. So, and there were differences, which I might illustrate here. This is the pre-AAR, I'm calling it 50-foot car. There's 6 equal width panels here, which is hard to see because of the quality of the image. By the 1942 AAR design, they had 8 panels on either side of the door, and it's an 8-foot wide door. And you got the 5/5 dreadnought ends and the Murphy panel roof. So, you know, it's looking like an AAR standard, even though it's not quite AARB standard. And here's variations of that. Some cars were double door, and there was one lot that had end doors. And some of these cars were rebuilt during World War II for aircraft wings, and they had their height increased to 12'6". And on those, they did increase the height of the doors, because I think they loaded the wings through the end doors. It'd be hard to load them through the side. Okay, 40-foot, 10-foot high cars, which are available in injection molded styrene in every scale. So everybody can model these cars. And they're pretty much standard. Black background before 1944. Oh, I went backwards, sorry. These are the last cars. These were built in early 1944, and that's got a black background. This is lot 734B. The lot 735B were built later in 44, and they did not have the black background in the old one. And here is a boxcar red lot 743B. This car is only 10 foot high, but it's got improved dreadnought ends, which is post-war design. And there were 1,000 of these cars, and they all got repainted into this scheme within a year. Well, actually, take that back. The first 525 in this scheme within a year, and the rest of them by 1949. And in the interest of saving time, I won't describe all this. At the same time as the pacemaker service, there were some 1910 cars with that heavy C-channel side sill rebuilt into cabooses. And some of them got painted into the red and gray paint scheme for pacemaker service. In 1946, they got some 50-foot cars that were of the AAR standard design. This is a builder's photo from ACF. These are some cars involved in the wreck, and that's one of those cars built in 45, sorry. More 40-foot cars, 10'6" inside height with the improved dreadnought ends. And this has a 4/4. This has the 3/4 with a rectangular rib, which started in 1949. And also, this car is boxcar red, but has the pacemaker freight service legend, which is this lot 773B. There were 1,000 cars. They were the only ones that were boxcar red with the pacemaker legend. And they had other differences from the red and gray cars. 40-foot PS1s, 5,000 of them were acquired late 40s, early 50s. Some of these cars I do believe were repainted into green later, but I haven't seen a color photos done. But they're basically a standard PS1. They started rebuilding the USRA cars, trying to get some more life out of them. Notice there's 4 lot numbers. It dawned on me just about a year ago that the 4 lot numbers correspond to the 4 original inside heights. So depending on what height car they brought in the shops, it got put into one of these 4 lot numbers. Because they didn't change the heights in that program, they just refurbished them and, you know, upgraded what needed to be upgraded. Now here's a car that's got hatch panels because they had the rust problem, just like the X29. Doors been upgraded, trucks are upgraded, it's got AV brakes. So these were all done in the early 50s, and so all the archaic hardware was being eliminated. And you know, this rebuilding program, without renumbering, by the way, well, these were not renumbered. Those other, the 4 lots did get renumbered, and that's all in handout. And they bought some more 50-foot cars between 1946 and 52. This is a lot that I believe was built in 46. Some with superior doors, others with Youngstown doors. Okay, more changes of paint and lettering in the post-war era. You know, it's kind of hard to tell in black and white photos, especially because people didn't photograph New York Central boxcars. You know, getting good photos is hard. But it seems like a lot of cars were built with black ends, but it certainly was not a universal policy. In 1955, they got rid of the Roman lettering with Gothic lettering, and they changed the size of the oval. They increased it by about 6 inches. Why, I'm not sure. They put black paint back in the background of the oval. And here's a good picture of a builder's photo of one of these with the new 1955 era lettering. And this is also a car built at dispatch shops with the proprietary end stamping that was built at East Rochester and dispatch shops. And also the roof, which if the image quality were better, you could see the dispatch roof panels had 2 little bumps in each panel, and they were straight across. And these were there was only 1 lot. It was, I believe, 2,000 cars, 40-foot long with dispatch ends and roof. And these were the last 40-foot cars built from New York Central, 1956. Now, the early bird scheme was applied to only 1 lot of cars, and again, I believe it was 2,000 cars, built in 1957, lot 862B. And the branch line model in HO scale is accurate for this car. And I don't think anybody else makes anything anywhere close to being accurate. But you'll see this paint job on lots of different models that are not accurate, because everybody likes the paint scheme. Okay, more changes of paint. At the end of the classic era, the century green color scheme comes in. Black ends and roof, introduced in late 58 with a 12-foot wide cigar band herald. The entire car was painted green starting sometime in the early 60s, and I'll show you this stripe was eliminated from the reporting marks. And by 1964, they reduced the cigar band to a 52-inch Scotch cowl. Okay, so here's from early 59 onward into the early 60s. This is what they were doing. 12-foot wide herald, stripe in the middle of the reporting marks, black roof, black ends, black underframe. And also, that C is not the same as the C in 1955, which is, in 1955, that lettering is called Century Gothic. It's a name for that font. This is not Century Gothic. It's an evolution, and all the letters are different, but the most obvious is the shape of the C. So that changed. And now this is just all the color photos that I had as of a year ago of New York Central boxcars. This is a Rutland 060, I believe that's a 106. That's a Peoria Eastern car. This is a Boston Albany car in color. It's not very good color. These were built new with the stripes above and below the reporting marks, unlike all the other cars built between these. And also, they never had the New York Central Oval Herald. They always just said Boston Albany in big letters. Here's the pacemaker cars. And this is a car, 1916 design, rebuilt in the 30s. That's a USRA all-steel car. And that, I believe, was photographed in northern New York State. This is an all-steel car post-World War II. The white star denoted that the car was suitable for clean lading. So when they were built new, they had the white star. And as soon as they got ruined by some shipper, they just stencil out the white star. This car obviously lasted a while without being wrecked. 1954, there were only 25 of these PS1s were built with an 8-foot door and cushion underframe. And it turns out, just recent information, Pullman Standard built 100 cars of this identical design and sold them to about a dozen different railroads, of which New York Central took 25 of the cars. And I think that was Pullman Standard trying to promote features they were trying to sell to the railroads, which included the cushion underframe and some other more esoteric features. And I believe trying to get them to go to the wider door. Because 8-foot doors on a 40-foot car were not too common in 54. So I think rather than New York Central going to Pullman Standard and saying, hey, we want 25 cars with special equipment, I think Pullman Standard went to New York Central and said, how would you like to try out some of these cars? And the other thing is, because it's 1954, pacemaker freight service was dying, and it was gone by 1957. So, why be acquiring new cars for a service that's getting used less and less? Here's another one of those increased height cars, but with a 55 paint scheme. This is a USRA all-steel car, I believe. This is from a calendar from a railroad club in Michigan. This is an IHB car. This is built in the early 40s. This is a 10-foot zero-high car with a 5.4 dreadnought end. And this is a post-1955 paint scheme with the Century Gothic lettering and has black background in the herald. This is another one of the USRA all-steel cars with indoors, post-1955 paint. You notice all these color shots are mostly post-55 paint scheme. This is another one from that calendar front. And there's something weird going on with this car. I don't know what the deal is with it's like an extension on the width of the door. This is on the Grand Trunk. It's a Grand Trunk steam locomotive. Now this is one of those cars that was rebuilt in the early 50s. You can see patch panels that rusted more quickly, or the paint weathered away more quickly than the paint on the original panels. It's obvious how this is a panel that was put in that replaced an auxiliary door that was eliminated. It's also got the rectangular raised panels in the roof because the roof was upgraded, and the number is not in that 101,000 or 125,499. This 30,000 is actually 29,500 to 31,000 something. So this would be no black background in the herald. This would be correct for early 50s right up into the 60s. Although by the mid-60s, these things were dropping like flies. Very few of these still in revenue service after the mid-60s. Here's another one of those cars in a post-55 paint scheme. And for a long time, I thought this car had a black end. Now I'm not so sure. This is another USRA all-steel. This is a 10-foot high car, probably original doors. This stencil here, I believe it says 167B. That's a pool. Cars in auto parts service would be put in a pool that would be assigned for radiators from the Ford radiator plant in Green Island, New York. And they'd ship radiators to Dearborn to be put into Fords. And then go back empty to Green Island, pick up more radiators. And they just shuttle back and forth in that service. And then Ford would go through a model change, and then they'd say, okay, we're not using those radiators anymore, so the cars would get taken out of that pool and assigned into another pool. And every time they put in a different pool, they'd renumber the car. And it's without having documents from the railroad, it's next to impossible to track all these renumberings, and so it's very difficult. But generally, if you want to show auto parts traffic, have a car numbered at the 79,000s into the 80,000s, because that's where those were. Each pool might be 100 cars or 5 cars, and the pool might last for 10 years or it might last for 6 months, and then go and get reassigned into another pool. And the car types kept coming and going. And so it's very difficult to follow, and there's not much information to hand out about that. This is just another color photo, 1955 paint scheme. And there's a color photo of the 862B. It's not very good color, but this herald is yellow, and I believe the lettering is blue. And the caricature of a bird is black and white, I believe. Here's the Century Green scheme, which we already talked about. And here's more. Now here the green stripe's been eliminated. Still got a black end, probably the roof is black. This is a USRA car with the eave extended.
We're 10 minutes over yet.
Yeah. AAR car, Century Green. And that's it. That's the end of the show. All right. Thanks for coming.